Thanks everyone, and thanks Anthony and Lynn for letting me come along and speak on the behalf of some of the private and independent providers. It's great to have this great group of people together and to be part of this discussion, which is inherently future focused, and I think that's exciting. Part of my role as DBC is advocating for blended and online learning and bringing technologies into everything that we do. Ours is largely a face-to-face provider at the moment, but it's fantastic to hear some of the myths that have been busted this morning. And I particularly like Gregor's slide of what we usually just accept about face-to-face delivery, because these sorts of discussions prompt questions about anything we do, really. So I'll move on. That's just the slide about the perspectives on the private sector from a light touch survey that we did. When Lynn and Karen and I were first having discussions, it was all around trying to just gather some insights from this sector. And as Lynn mentioned, it's usually just the student voice that we've had in terms of some of the data. So this is what we're going to do in the session today. We'll start off with some of the external drivers that are influencing us. If you've been interested in the disruption discourse, that's part of what's happening in our sector. If we look ahead, you can be slightly apocalyptic about it. I don't know whether it'll go that far, but we are seeing some changes, as Lynn suggested in some of the data that's been presented already. So we'll have a quick look at that. Some of the trends that we know about student preferences, things like the EY report that came out earlier in the year, people may have seen that. And then how we developed this survey. I will stress that it's just a light touch approach, because when we were talking about a survey, we didn't want it to be seen to be coming from TEQSA as the regulator. We were just curious about people's confidence and their sense of efficacy in their online or blended delivery. So that was the origin of it. The key themes that came out due to a few of the questions that we asked, and then some examples that came out. And it's a heartening story in a way, even though it was delivered just in the last couple of months, because we did see some examples of practice that people were happy to share. Anyone who's been in that sharing space, you know that academics are inherently nervous about sharing because they don't necessarily want to blow their own trumpets. They don't necessarily have the confidence that they've judged their practice in a way that would be seen as excellent by other eyes. So it was great to see some of those examples shared. So I'll just go through some of these external drivers that we see. If you've been reading about this disruption space, you'll be familiar with some of these themes that are coming up. But the first one really comes to the question of Gregor's slide about what the role of the person out the front is. If we think that we're the one who delivers the content to our learners, we're very wrong. If you go online, you can get so much information. Things like Explain Everything, where you've got later year students being generous and just explaining some of the core concepts that they've grappled with to students who've just embarked on that learning journey. These things are freely available. They are 24/7. They're often snapshots rather than us saying to the students, come and listen to loads of lectures or engage with a whole textbook. So they're small pieces of information for people to engage with when they need them. I've set this up to sort of say what's happening and when should we be dealing with it, and most of them have the response of now. The next one is employment is changing. My institution, which I should have explained that lovely picture at the front, the International College of Management is in Sydney, in Manly. People who know the old seminary, the old sandstone building on the top of the hill. So we started off 20 odd years ago as a hospitality college. I could talk for quite a while about that, but essentially it was mirroring the Swiss hotel schools, coming out and plonking into Manly, rows in all the classrooms, a very strict curriculum, 3 assessment tasks per semester, a lot of control, but a vocational context. And then over time that moved to more of a higher ed. It was a mix for a time. And so part of my job is to question some of those delivery models that were very traditional, very controlled, but not always in a good way, I have to say. So it's a changing focus in an industry. We have hospitality students who'll end up doing things like managing robots rather than managing people. So we need to future-proof that learning in a way that's becoming very stark to us. Michael mentioned having the printed dress. You know, those technologies are becoming much more mainstream, even though we may not see them usually in our classrooms just yet. The next one is the idea of the boundaries blurring. So places like Singularity U question our traditional shapes of institutions because they do have those very close links with employment and employers, and the students can get very, very practical learning experiences in a way that just does challenge the types of institutions that we're usually representing. And that integration between will and what the students are doing in their lectures or their tutorials. The next one has been mentioned earlier on because Grant was mentioning about micro-credentialing, the notion of Udacity's model of very short courses. So whether we confine ourselves to offering those longer programs that, I mean, quite frankly, people in the education sector usually like their university experience so much that they decided they'd stay around, and we've ended up being inside the institution. And that is something that other learners, younger learners, will increasingly question if we look at some of the data we have ahead of us. So that kind of upskilling that was mentioned earlier on, how do we prepare our quality assurance processes to loop those sorts of opportunities in? And the next one, I would say, to me, is the most surprising, but certainly a stark warning for us. Because usually when you talk about people's preferences for online, there's still this preference for face-to-face. And that has been true until that most recent EY report that came out in about, I don't know, April or so this year. So if you think that current university students, roughly 20 or so % of them, are quite open-minded about online learning, that's fully online learning. But when you ask the current school students, they're our future, that spikes right up to 40%. So 40% of the people that EY surveyed, which was from memory about 4,000 when they were doing that survey, they were quite open-minded about fully online delivery, which is sort of surprising when you think about the first year experience literature and young students wanting to come to campus. Those sorts of things, when we've been planning our blended delivery strategies, it's often on that premise that students will want to come to us for that beautiful Manly experience in the first year. But we have to question that when we see some of that data. So I kind of like that because it makes us question what we do, even if we've been very comfortable in those spaces in the past. So I'll move on. I also grappled with how to present the data from the DET report of a couple of years ago, and what I went for was the magnification strategy. So face-to-face is still a very large component of those diagrams, but if you have a look at the blended delivery increase, the multimodal, that's gone up by such a huge percentage, and even online learning, although it was starting from a low base, it's still increasing very rapidly. So that's just a different way of presenting the data that Lynn had earlier on. Now, anyone who's been playing in this space, I was thinking about Michael's comment about when he started delivering. My sojourn into using technologies for delivery was when I was living in New Zealand, in Nelson. And we ended up flying up to Malaysia to work out how to set up some horrific recording materials to be able to assess students who'd gone home sort of partway through their learning journey with us in Nelson. So we ended up flying up, there were teams of us setting up this technology, and it was the end of the 90s. So I've had a couple of decades of playing around in this space. And this is a transformation model that Maria Spies and myself presented at last year's TEXA conference, which really, the model is about how we approach this very complex environment that looks like a lot of random things all smudged together. And how we worked to craft a framework to help us engage with that chaos, really. So a framework so that we understand which levers we need to pull and how we can approach coordinating that transformation initiative. So that's what that slide was about, talking about the different areas that a quality assurance or a transformation process needs to consider. So then we came to the question about what we know about the private providers or the independent providers. The answer, when we spoke earlier in this year, it was really that we didn't have that much information about the confidence of providers like ours in the quality that they in their offerings of blended or online delivery. So drawing on some of the frameworks that have already been available and already mentioned earlier today, we drew up a light touch survey. It was not intended to be very long, and it was completely voluntary, anonymous, unless people decided that they wanted to include their names so that I could then follow up and ask them for the examples of practice they'd offered to share. So then we talked about how we would distribute this, and we kind of played on the goodwill of a lot of people who are in this room representing networks such as ACPET and Kofi, all the networks that we were part of and that we knew about, to invite them to participate in this space. I should also include the TAFE Directors Network, although, as I'll explain in the next slide, we only had one TAFE respondent, so no matter how much I played with the numbers, I wasn't going to be dealing with an N of 1 to represent TAFE, so sadly that respondent had to be removed from the data set. So we had 32 respondents. Let's say we'll call it 130 or so, although that number I think does change, and the one TAFE that I said was removed. So we started off with questions like the size of your institution so that we could get some sense of who we were talking about. Now, I've worked in enormous global institutions. I was at Navitas before I came to ICMS. That's 120 colleges globally, about 80,000 students. I'd worked at Macquarie Uni and UNSW before that, so I knew the single large institution environment. Then I knew that very large global sort of lots of colleges, some of them very, very small, and now our college is also small. So it's kind of a good range of things from my own experience to be trying to work out what types of questions we wanted to ask people. You can see that the largest group of respondents was actually from the less than 500 full-time students. So they're quite small institutions that then, to me, I associate usually small institutions with lean teams. Everyone here probably says they come from a lean environment where everybody has way too much work to do. But if you're talking about small colleges, people very often do have a couple of different hats. So also that 1,000 to 3,000 was quite well represented. Then we asked a key question, and after this, if you didn't really use too much technology in your learning and teaching, you didn't have to go on to the rest of the questions. So we put in a bit of skip logic to save people's time if they didn't need to proceed. But this one was really talking about on a continuum. I should mention that was one of the interesting questions we had about whether to just narrow the scope to completely online. But I'm so glad looking at this data that we didn't, because the blended space is the real growth area. And if these questions and this forum is about quality improvement, that's an opportunity for us rather than narrowing our scope to purely online. We certainly mean we're only focusing on a smaller group if we do that. So you can see that in terms of the size of the respondents group, those who had all on campus with no requirements for students to go online, that was still a fairly large group. That was about 14. And then we had the 17, which were the mix of on-campus and online students. So they had students required to engage with both of those in terms of the subjects they offered, and completely online was the last group. So that was still very small. But if you think back to the earlier slide talking about the growth, it's starting from a small base, and this data set certainly confirms that it's just a small area so far. Now this one, in a way, was reflecting some of the presentation that Michael did earlier about the benchmarks, about having an effective strategy that would guide these decisions around blended and online delivery. So the question said, do you have an effective strategy? And you can see that most of the people in our data set thankfully agreed that they had an effective strategy. So there were 10 respondents in the agree or the strongly agreed space. But there were a few colleges that had respondents saying they weren't sure that they had a good strategy to guide their decisions. So that to me says that there's an opportunity for things like highlighting the guidance and the templates and the samples, going back to that comment about usually small and lean teams. The more we can provide people with some examples of what they might use through things like guidance notes, for example, then that might help that group of overworked individuals be able to engage with some of this already evident literature and research that we have in the sector. The next one was asking questions about quality assurance at the course level. And I thought this was quite interesting because there was a strong agreement that there were quality assurance measures happening at that course level. So that's the whole program in our kind of language. But less so at the, or actually, sorry, the other way around, more so at the subject level. So that to me is interesting because in roles like mine in terms of transformation, often there is the discussion around what happens at the subject level. But if that doesn't transpose itself into that course level opportunity, then you miss some of those pedagogical chances, if you'd like to call it that. So for example, the first year experience. So we can talk about assuring quality for each of the subjects, but not necessarily how they kind of stack together to form the student's complete experience. So that was an interesting point for me, thinking about the difference, that gap between the subject and the course level. I'll just give you a summary of some of the next questions. Of the 17 respondents, 19 didn't have a quality assurance around micro-credentialing. 4 said they did, and 4 said they weren't sure. I guess that's because it's quite a small space still. We didn't do any probing kind of questions in this survey. As I said, it was just a light touch. In terms of people using external benchmarks, Michael had a very impressive list of all the benchmarks they could have been using. 11 of the respondents did use those, but 5 didn't and 1 wasn't sure. So again, that to me says there's an opportunity to make people aware of some of these things so they either don't reinvent the wheel or kind of blithely go along thinking they're just using their own experiences. There have been very wise brains working in this space for a long time, and it's great to draw on that knowledge and experience rather than small colleges trying to work out some of these things for themselves. The quality assurance cycles question was an interesting one. 13 said they had them in place, a couple didn't. So that idea of loops, feeding back in what they find and a continuous improvement focus. And then these next couple of questions, they were around things like professional development. So if we link these new strategies with underpinning the capability of our existing staff, we need to make sure that we're not setting up a gap where the students have an expectation of what online learning might be like, and that is quite positive as we've seen from some of those reports. But if we don't equip people with how to actually meet those needs, that is likely to end up in a negative situation. So this one was interesting in terms of the types of PD that the institutions offered. The first column is about designing blended and online learning. So is PD available for your staff in that design space? The second column is about delivering, and that's the most common. The next one is about supporting students, so you can see that starting to drop off. And the last one is none at all. So some of the colleges didn't have PD available. So again, that opportunity to make things more widely available for the sector so that people can engage with those. Often if you have sessional teaching staff, they might have PD opportunities from elsewhere. So this is not to say that they can't engage with them at all. The next question says, is your institution broadly satisfied with the student outcomes? It was great to see that most the respondents were they were happy that the quality was high in their institution. And the key challenges and the barriers that they offered, 16 out of the 17 did actually say, yes, we had some challenges. And if you have a look at that list, resources and time, consistent application, Michael brought that up in his presentation earlier too, the communication around it, engaging staff and PD. But to me, they all point to the need for strategies to form decisions and plans around those needs. So once you know you're going to need resourcing, you're going to need comms, that kind of thing can be planned into the strategy. I'll quickly take you through some examples of good practice that these were listed at the end of the survey if people were happy to share. Navitas's framework was that one I showed you earlier on. And then we have our own, because I have the luxury of starting with quite a blank space in terms of my role. We've been working with Dr. Sarah Booth in this space, which has been fantastic. And you can see that it's comprehensive in terms of a 7-year cycle. But we also have what we're calling the campus equity strategy, and online, just notionally, is one column. So every question we ask ourselves, we have to make sure that we include that online equity as part of that strategy. This is a great example from ACAP, which was a design thinking project. I'll go through it quickly, but when you have a look at it, it's great in terms of they are students and lots of other stakeholders, but particularly students, where the pain points were in their fully online delivery. Assessment is one of my research interests, and surprise, surprise, that was one of the things that came up. But also basic things like orientation, how they engaged with the online environment. These are completely online students. So it's great to have this insight into what we need to fix. So that was fantastic, and thanks to Catherine Tracy for sharing that. They were sort of at the institutional and then at that sort of subject level or course level. This comes down to the subject level where we had some offerings of good practice where people said they approached consistency using a couple of different tools. For example, Storyline got a mention there. Having access to the lectures recorded through Echo 360 was also offered. Navitas has some guidelines for blended and flipped delivery that they use in some of the colleges. And then Montessori has a teaching mentor program that they have a team teaching kind of approach. And then ICMS has some guidelines and minimum standards for our Moodle sites, which has sort of been mentioned earlier on. This one was talking about PD. The ACER, they fund anyone to attend PD. So that was a very happily received piece of good practice that they were happy to herald. And Navitas globally, in 2 years, that small team at Navitas delivered 16,000 PD hours globally, often to sessional teaching staff and often delivered by sessional teaching staff because they wanted to share their practice. All of that's freely available, so you can go and have a look at it. It's amazing, really, when you see it. Some key lessons learned. So, accuracy and currency. We can start with the basics here. If we know that lots of us are encouraging students to use the online space, we should make sure we're showing them the right information. It's current, it's accurate, and they can get what they need in those spaces. Because 60% of the respondents from this survey said they did want students to go online and find things. We need to give some guidance and templates because, as I said before, if we help lean teams operate at a higher level of quality, that does the whole sector a good service. And then a third of them didn't use external benchmarks, and almost a quarter didn't have QA processes that they could describe. Maybe they have them, but they didn't articulate them that way. There was if we focus on a whole of course strategy, then that means we build in some of those pedagogical stages that we know about from decades of literature. So that suggests the move from a subject to a course, which is a bit more of a holistic approach. And the last one was really a happy tale about the generosity of the sector, which I think may traditionally have been slightly competitive because we are all in a competitive environment in the for-profit space. But people were so generous, it was really heartening in the surveys and the conversations I had subsequently. So that's all I have for the presentation for you today. So I'll just stop there. I think I don't have any questions or anything like that, but yes.
Thank you, Margot.
Okay.